Let me just ask you one more basic question here, and I promise we'll get this audience in the act here. Did Adam Smith, or do you, how do you feel about this desperate need to grow? We have
no desperate need to grow.
Oh, we do. We brag about our gross national product. It's going to be $1 trillion. A guy's got 2 franchises. He wants 6. A man has 3 hamburger stands. He wants 12.
We have no desperate need to grow. We have a desperate desire to grow. And those are quite different. I believe that the level of growth in this country ought to be whatever people want it to be. If the people at large, if each and every person separately was satisfied with where he is and didn't want to grow, fine. I have no objection. I don't want to impose growth on anybody. I want people to be free to pursue their own objectives. But it so happens that the American people have been a very dynamic, forward-looking people, and they have wanted to improve their conditions. But they haven't been wanting to stay
But does
still.
numbers necessarily improve it? Hasn't the last 30 years demonstrated that that hasn't worked?
No, we haven't had an increase in numbers, and the last 30 years has not demonstrated that. Most people in this country are better off today than they were 30 years ago, although they're worse off than they were 6 or 7 or 8 years ago.
All right, just one, let me chase you down one more time on this. General Motors wants to grow as well. That's okay with you.
Of course.
They have a natural desire to grow, huh?
Right.
Okay.
But other people have also a natural desire, and other people check it. The check to General Motors growth is Toyota and Volkswagen. It's Checker Cab.
Well, I think it's interesting that the checks have come from outside this country.
They haven't always come from outside this country.
But the point I'm making is General Motors has more power to grow.
No. General Motors cannot get $1 out of your pocket unless you voluntarily pay it over. The government can, and that's the fundamental difference.
All right, here's where I'm going with this. You give me a hard time trying to get there, but I think as General Motors grows, I see the possibility of abuse. Or as any company grows, as the Donahue Show grows. Suddenly I decide I've got all the answers and start preaching. Now your point is some gal come along and shoot me down pretty good, and I lose, and that's the way the system is.
The bigger they are, the harder they fall.
Good, gotcha.
W.T. Grant, being an enormously big company, didn't keep it from going bankrupt. The New York Central, being a big company, didn't keep it from going bankrupt. Chrysler Corporation may be the 3rd automobile company, but it's a $13 billion company. It's one of the biggest companies in this country. That isn't going to keep it from going bankrupt.
Here's the killer, though. When somebody does come along with a better mousetrap, the multinational mousetrap company buys it. And now we're back to mediocrity again. And the initiative and the talent of the little old man in the shoe shop who came up with a better is gone.
Temporarily. There are new people coming up with the little old men in the shoe shops. And one of the major reasons, as I was saying before, why multinationals are able to occupy the position they are is because government rules and regulations favor multinationals. Almost all government regulation favors big companies over little companies.
And you think Exxon ought to be able to buy Reliance Electric?
Of course.
And what else you want them to buy? The hotels too? I mean, where are we going to stop?
Look, if you say to Exxon, look, one thing we're going to do is to make it impossible for you to make any money producing oil. What do you think their stockholders want them to do?
Have a hard time getting the American people to agree with that type of thing.
First of all, Exxon doesn't buy anything. There isn't any Exxon. There are people. Exxon is a corporation owned by individual people. It's the stockholders of Exxon who ultimately are buying it. And if they don't like what Exxon is doing with their money, they have a perfectly good alternative. They can sell the stock. And as the stock went down, if the stockholders didn't like it, it would pay somebody to change the policy which Exxon is following. We have a far greater degree of control over what Exxon does than we have over what a lot of our government corporations do.
Milton Friedman returns in a moment.
Dr. Friedman, you've spoken a lot today about corporations. What does the average citizen do to help the inflation or to fight it?
There is nothing the individual citizen can do to help or fight inflation in his personal behavior. All attempts to tell you it's the consumer who's doing, the wasteful consumer who's producing inflation is an attempt by the government to shift the blame to somebody else. As a citizen, you can do a great deal. As a citizen, you can exercise your influence on your congressman at the elections to try to elect people who are committed to cutting government spending. As you may know, a group of us have been working for a long time on constitutional amendments to set a limit to total spending. Such amendments have now been passed in 5 states. We're working on a federal amendment an amendment to the federal Constitution that would give the federal government a budget. I think the most important single step that can be taken to stop inflation is to cut down government spending. And you can play a role in that. Your personal life, you cannot do a thing, and don't let anybody kid you.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
I worked for Sears for 2.5 years, and every day I went past a little board that said Kmart 31, Sears 19, 21. And I was just wondering, what happened?
What do you mean, the price of the stock?
Yeah?
Yeah, they quoted it, and it was
Yeah,
just,
I know. I've seen it all the time.
And I was in profit sharing, and I kind of started to wonder, with all Sears pushing to sell and to produce and just to be marvelous, what happened? Why is Kmart?
Why is Kmart? I'm not a business expert. I don't know why Kmart went ahead of Sears. If I knew that, I'd be in a different business. All I know is that they managed to appeal to the consumer. They made better decisions about what products to sell than Sears did. Now, who was responsible or why? You'd have to be an expert. In a way, I'm not.
Kmart was better at discounting than Sears.
Well, fine. That's what consumers wanted. Fine, and they served the consumer.
Didn't when Sears decided that it would approach or broach the issue of the arena of discounting, their sales shot up.
Well, they still
but their profits diminished.
I don't know anything about the details. For all I know, Sears is streamlined. It's going to go and beat Kmart. I don't have the slightest idea. Let the market decide.
The oil-rich Arabs are buying an awful lot of businesses in this country and farmland and things. Do you think it'd be wise for this country to institute law like Mexico did in the 50s and 60s, where it required that any company and land had to be at least over 50% owned by residents of the country?
I believe in individual freedom on an international basis and not on a national basis. I think you ought to be free to buy land if you want to in Mexico or anywhere else, and I would like those governments to let you. This country did not become great by preventing people from coming here from abroad and buying land and setting up businesses. Quite the other way around. And the reason we are making it so advantageous for them to buy here is because we're following such silly, counterproductive policies.
Didn't it do a lot of damage in Mexico, though, when
it did much more damage to Mexico when they nationalized the oil industry. On the contrary, their measures to keep foreigners from acquiring assets in Mexico did a great deal of harm to Mexico, not good. Yes. You must distinguish between what looks on the surface and what it really is underneath.
Over here.
Why is it we have so many millionaires and everything in the United States, and we still have so many impoverished people who try to get up into the world? Why is it we have this lack of money where people who can't support themselves decently and get a decent job, where all these big men are up on top making oodles and oodles of money? They don't need it. They can only eat that much, sleep in the bed.
And what do you suppose they do? If they don't eat it and don't use it, what do you suppose they do?
They hoard it.
What do you mean they hoard it? You mean they put it under their pillows?
That's right. No, they keep investing it.
Investing it in what?
That's right, yeah.
What do they invest it in?
Well, in oil and everything, where, I mean, all these other people who are
What do they invest in? Don't get off the subject.
No.
What do they invest it in?
Well, they invested in a lot of different things that the little people need.
Well, do they invest it in factories?
Yes.
Does some of that money end up in machines?
Yes.
Do those factories and machines provide ordinary working people with jobs or not? What do you suppose the productivity of this country would be and of the wage rate would be if the total amount of capital in this country today was what it was 100 years ago? Where do you suppose the improvements in productivity come from except from the investment by people of their savings? But let me go to your fundamental question. First place, nirvana is not for this world. There is no paradise. Of course we've got a lot of people who are poorly off. But if you look at it over time, if you get a sense of proportion, the well-being of the ordinary people has been the main thing that has been improved by economic progress and economic growth and development. And most residual hard cases of poverty today are the result, again, of a failure of government. Why do we have a black teenage unemployment rate in 30 to 40%? Because of two failures of government. One, a failure to provide decent schooling, which is a governmental responsibility. Has been, whether it should be or not, it has been. And second, because of a minimum wage rate, which prevents those kids who haven't had decent schooling from getting jobs at low pay at which they can earn the skills on the jobs that would enable them to rise to higher pay. If you look at the sources of poverty, you will find most of them are derived from what I regard as wrong-headed government policies.
Well, I'm trying to look ahead because I'm almost going to retire.
Yes?
And it's pretty
Social
hard
Security
making
is
it
a
go
very-
now before, you know, you retire.
You're covering a lot of issues here. I might say, if Phil will pardon me, I'm going to cover all of these issues.
Yeah,
Much
please,
more
let's get this plug in, because it is an important program, which is, that's all I need is,
I've
this
been
one is going
involved
to
for the
compete now
last-
with Guess Who? He's got his own TV show. I mean, I'm not insecure enough. This is on PBS, and your first show is in January.
January 11th, there will be 10 one-hour shows covering all of these issues in considerable depth. Half-hour documentary, half-hour studio discussion with people from the other side. I may say we invited Ralph Nader, but I don't believe he's accepted.
Just before we break here, and we have to, I want to make sure I understand you. Because the government sets a minimum wage, what does McDonald's do?
McDonald's? It can't hire as many teenagers. It improves its capital equipment to serve. It does less business because it has to charge higher hamburger prices. In the absence of a minimum wage, McDonald's would be able to offer a larger number of jobs to a larger number of youngsters, and they would be able to acquire some skills. And not only McDonald's.
So we hire more people get work. Younger people.
The younger people would work, and they'd get a chance to develop their skills to become productive members of society instead of being driven into a cycle of poverty and of welfare, which is absolutely deplorable.
Milton Friedman, the economist, returns in a moment.
I want to know if you charge a lot for your services. In other words, how much do you get paid?
As much as the market will stand. I believe in a market price, and I tell you something. I think people value what they get at what they pay for it.
And what are you doing with your money?
That is my business and not yours.
Dr. Freeman.
Yes.
I'd like to know your view on the busing situation, especially with the gas situation.
Of course, I'll be glad to tell you my view on the busing situation. The general, very little time. The fundamental idea is that people should be free to choose. That's the title of our TV series, incidentally, is Free to Choose. They should be free to choose whether they want to send their child to this school or that school or any other school. And the way to do it is to introduce a voucher scheme so that people can have freedom to choose. I am not in favor of compulsory busing. I am not in favor of compulsory integration. I am in favor of freedom.
What'd you say about voucher? The voucher what?
I would have a voucher system. You said I had to keep it brief, so I can only mention it. A system under which parents who chose not to send their child to a particular public school would be entitled to a payment like the GI Bill of Rights, a voucher which they could use at any school of their choice.
Yeah, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to open a school.
Very good.
And I'm going to hire an advertising agency.
Well, wonderful.
And I'm going to have cheerleaders saying, go to Donahue High, because it's got the best football team, and I'm going to get all these vouchers, and I'm going to have the biggest super school in the whole county.
Wonderful. Marvelous.
I don't know if it's wonderful.
If you can succeed, you cannot succeed by advertising what's not true. Ford Motor Company couldn't sell an Edsel that way, and I don't think even Phil Donahue could sell lousy education that way.
Yes.
You know, people think the public at large are a bunch of stupid people. They're not.
Yeah.
Doctor, is there anything the average citizen can do to protect himself from the ravages of the rising inflation?
Unfortunately, there is very, very little he can do. I hate to say this, and yet it's true. The most effective protection against inflation is high living.
How do you mean that? How do you mean that?
I mean that. Unfortunately, there are no assets which you can confidently acquire with the expectation that they will provide you a hedge against inflation. On the other hand, if you buy yourself a nice house, you buy yourself a nice suit, you buy yourself a picture to hang on the wall, you are protected against the ravages of inflation.
So, in other words, convert your money into material things?
Unfortunately, it's not a very desirable thing to do. Don't convert all of it. You've got to have some reserve for emergency. I'm not saying this is a good thing. I'm saying that inflation is the kind of thing which leaves you with no good choices.
But that sounds like playing the violin while Rome is burning.
Well, tell me the alternative. The question was not what the nation ought to do.
Yeah.
I have no difficulty in saying what our governmental policy ought to be to end inflation. That's a different question. The question is, what can I as an individual do? And unfortunately, given the uncertainty of inflation, given the fact that real estate has proved a good hedge and it's proved a bad hedge, that stocks have proved a good hedge and they've proved a bad hedge, that government bonds are a snare and a delusion, that they have proved a very, very poor investment for the poor suckers who were induced by Uncle Sam to come into them. Unfortunately, there is no good way in which the ordinary citizen, the ordinary person, can really protect his assets against inflation.
Dr. Friedman, I wanted to point out that a lot of people will agree that medical care costs are terribly expensive these days, and some hospitals that I know of, particularly in the South, have cost containment programs that are voluntary. Are these feasible? And if they are, why don't other businesses start them?
Well, in the first place, every business has a cost containment program. There is no business in this country that doesn't unless it's on the verge of bankruptcy. In the second place, in all of these questions, one shouldn't look at the symptoms. One ought to go back and ask what the sources are. The reason why medical costs have been rising so rapidly in the country is, again, I sing the same old tune, but it happens to be true. Because whereas some 15 or 20 years ago, government spending on medical care accounted for something like 10, 20% of the total amount spent on medical care. That was mostly in public health and for veterans. Today, it amounts to something like 40% or more of the total spending, and that's what's been driving these prices up.
Milton Friedman returns in a moment. You'd be against mandatory wearing of helmets for motorcyclists, too.
Of course. I think people ought to be free to do what they want.
What's wrong with... why can't the government be paternalistic and maternalistic and care for its citizens?
Well, that depends on what kind of government you want. Of course it can be, but it turns out that the paternalism tends to serve the interests of the people who are being paternal and not the people whom they are supposedly protecting.
And it's expensive.
I am not... don't misunderstand me. I'm not against all government measures. I'm not an anarchist. I believe we need a government for certain basic functions. We need a government to protect this country from foreign enemies. We need a government to protect me from being bashed over the head by you. And because you can find some valid function of government doesn't mean that everything government does is valid. And the problem today is not that we have too little government, but much too much government.
Milton Friedman can be seen on PBS next year in several one-hour shows. Many thanks to this Nobel Prize winner for bringing his enthusiasm to our show, and thank you for your participation. Have a nice day, everybody.